Well, I think for anybody who comes here, just look about you, look around.
It's kind of like a three-tiered cake, and so each layer has a different type of flora, and there's lots of little microclimates within, and so we have these little pockets of different habitat.
Go out to the center of the island, past Fort Holmes in the spring, and see blankets of trillium that grow in the woods, and it's so quiet. You can hear the birds sing, there aren't crowds of people.
The fresh air, the cooling lake breezes, that's kind of unique here, but it's really the geological history of the island.
It started about 400 million years ago or so with the limestone being laid down, but then the limestone in this Mackinac region kind of fractured and re-cemented to make this special hard breccia formation. So that's the formation that resisted erosion. So things like Arch Rock, Sugarloaf, Skull Cave, all of these are made of that special Mackinac breccia limestone.
You don't see those in other places here in northern Michigan, and so that has been a reason that people have always wanted to be here, is for that kind of unique environment.
Mackinac is very, very special. It's the gem of Michigan, but we have to preserve what we have.
Mackinac is always right in the middle of the show, whether it's the fur trade or the fishing industry. Even tourism is important because the travel is on the water, whether it's early dugout canoes, sailing vessels, or the early steamships. Business always comes by Mackinac Island, and so it's right in the middle of the water highway system. On top of that, it's a unique geological location because the island has this large humpbacked appearance. It's higher than the other lands around here, and so that attracted people, really beginning with the native people who named it Michilimackinac, place of the great turtle, looking like this turtle coming out of the water because of its humpbacked appearance.
I think Mackinac has always been a gathering place from the time before the voyageurs came, from native people. This was always set aside as a rather special place.
The first written description we have of Arch Rock and some of the other natural formations on the island was written October 30th, 1802 by Dr. Francis LeBaron. It was published in a Boston newspaper and it kind of got Mackinac Island on the map, if you will.
In the 1870s, Mackinac was already a place of resort, and this had begun in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The first summer hotels opened on the island in the 1840s.
People had been coming here increasingly for vacation, for pleasure, for a couple of decades at that point. It was kind of put on pause by the Civil War.
The industries of Mackinac had faded by this point. The fur trade was gone. The fishing industry had come and gone already. The first boarding houses had opened up on Mackinac Island in the 1840s and 50s, and some tourism had started before the Civil War.
And after the Civil War, there was that post-Civil War desire to escape. People wanted to get away from the tragedy of the nation being torn against itself at war for 5 years, and they also wanted to get away from rapidly industrializing American cities, which were becoming increasingly uncomfortable to live in, with the coal smoke and the machinery noise. Then you add on top of that the summer heat and humidity. People of means began to look for places that they could go in the summer and get away from it all.
For generations, Mackinac has been known as one of Michigan's most revered places of natural beauty. But it isn't luck or happenstance that the character of this island has been so richly preserved. While it may be our most renowned state park today, few of the summer visitors who arrive in droves at the ferry docks are aware of its shared history with our most famous national park.
The origin of Mackinac National Park really begins with the first national park in the country, and of course that's Yellowstone.
The idea, especially on a federal level, was very new. Yellowstone in 1872 was the first national park in the United States. President Lincoln had actually set aside some land in 1864 in the Yosemite Valley as a state park in California, but as a national park, this would only be the second.
We had Yellowstone, and then we had Mackinac Island. And up until 1890, those were the only two.
Preserving something specifically for the enjoyment of the people, for its natural history, for its cultural history, that was pretty novel.
The idea came about in 1873 that perhaps Mackinac Island was a place that was worthy of preservation as well. It was championed by a senator from Michigan named Thomas Ferry, who grew up on Mackinac Island. His father was William Ferry, who ran the Protestant mission here along with his wife, Amanda in the 1820s and 30s. And Thomas, having grown up here, loved Mackinac, wanted to preserve Mackinac, and he was the one who championed the cause in Congress.
It's interesting when you say Thomas W. Ferry. The school that I went to on the island was named after him, which is now the Manugian Arts Center, but that was our school.
He's born at the Mission House, and this is part of his early childhood. Later entered the House of Representatives and eventually the Senate, and was aware of those development pressures.
He wanted to really both promote the island as a place, a destination, and also preserve what was here. Not only the natural scenery, but the historic charm. Those two went hand in hand.
He really saw this real threat that these areas of the island, about 50% of it still being federal land, could be simply turned over into private interests. He had seen it already on the island in 1871, the place of his birth, the old mission on the island. It's now a hotel since the 1840s. In 1871, the U.S. government finally turned that over to the owners of the hotel.
While Ferry's intentions may have been rooted in the emotional pull to preserve his birthplace and assure that it would be protected in perpetuity, his time in Congress had also made him shrewdly aware of what it took to appeal to the votes he would need. A big financial investment from the government in Michigan's quaint little island sanctuary would be a non-starter. But what if everything that was needed to manage a park was arguably already there?
Something that a lot of people don't maybe think about so much is how cheap the federal government was for most of American history. If there was a way to not spend money, they would do it. And so yeah, the fact that the federal government already owned about 50% of the land area here on the island as part of the military reservation surrounding Fort Mackinac, that there was already a garrison here, there's already federal employees here, that meant that, at least in theory, this would cost nothing.
Nothing had to be purchased. The Army's already here to run it, so there's no appropriation in this legislation.
So it goes President Grant, and he signed that legislation early in 1875, setting aside that area as Mackinac National Park, as the second national park. And very quickly, that means that the garrison here took on some additional responsibilities. The commanding officer took on additional responsibilities, and Ferry himself lobbied for additional soldiers.
I would suspect that when the Mackinac National Park was created, that the post-commandant spent almost as much time managing the Mackinac National Park as he did managing his soldiers inside the fort.
So we're talking about half of the island, about 1,080 acres. The island's about 2,400 acres or so, so the federal government owned about half of that, and that was all set aside as national parkland.
Another early complication was that the idea of using the fort's handful of soldiers to also act as instant park rangers was much easier said than done.
That may have been the theory that the garrison is here, that the soldiers could maintain the park, improve it, and things like that. That idea that no money should be spent, the War Department refused to authorize additional funding. Soldiers could be placed on something called extra duty, basically over and above their normal military chores, and they were supposed to be paid extra for that extra duty. The War Department refused to authorize that extra duty pay to go out and work in the park, essentially a non-military duty. And so those 100 or so soldiers who were stationed here were essentially limited to the garrison itself. And they made many improvements inside there, but by and large, they didn't work out in the park because there was no money to pay them to do so.
Outside of a paycheck, there were additional complications when it came to the idea of the Fort Station soldiers acting as park staff. Not only was there a common mistrust of the military in American culture at the time, but it also raised some uncomfortable questions about whether the federal government had the right to enforce civilian laws or get involved in property boundary disputes.
It's not something they would have learned at West Point, how to run a park. I think they felt it's a job. It's a new duty they have, and they took it seriously. And they tried to protect the park. They tried to provide amenities for the visitors here, tried to make sure that it was open to the public.
The commanding officers definitely felt the weight of responsibility to protect the park. They had the park rules that are created quickly after the park itself was created. But those commanding officers were kind of torn between these two directives. One, preventing them from expending the money, and two, enforcing those rules. So it essentially boils down to sending out one soldier. If you could call anyone a park ranger, it's that one soldier who goes out on mounted patrol. And that starts relatively late, like 1887, because the officer said that the park is full of con men and three-card Monte artists, people trying to peel bark off trees, trying to chip off pieces of arch rock. And it falls to that single soldier to try and enforce those rules. So by and large, that's it.
There was no real good enforcement mechanism. There was a fine that could be levied and even jail time, but that was never actually enforced. A lot of times the locals who are cutting firewood, for example, would even do it at night, so they would kind of sneak and do that.
Yellowstone may have been the original national park, but Mackinac was the first where the federal government had taken such an active role. They were figuring it out as they went along and frequently dealt with the question of public preservation and service versus private rights and profit. Plus, as if the overly eager tourists and entitled inhabitants weren't enough, they even had their hands full with some of the island's four-legged locals.
So in addition to people, mostly island residents, going out and chopping down trees, things like that, tourist-facing things, it's cattle. It's people who lived here, had cows and other cattle, and, letting them graze as they had done for decades before. They would just wander wherever they felt that they could find something to eat. They didn't really make a distinction between park grass and private property grass, I guess.
It was considered, government land, so I'm just going to let my cows and pigs just forage around here, and keeping them out was a problem, again, the Army never solved in the years that it ran the national park, try as they may.
Even with pressure from the federal government for an expense-free endeavor on the island, the original legislation, drawn up by Thomas Ferry and put into law by President Grant, did offer a creative solution for funding some of those necessary improvements. It would just take time and a little luck to finally follow through with it.
When the national park was created in 1875, authority was given to the park superintendent, the post commandant, to lease small parcels of property in which people could build summer homes. And two areas were generally set aside, one known as the East End and one known as the West End, later known as the East and West Bluffs. But unfortunately, they didn't give him any money or the resources to properly survey and stake the land so that the plots could be leased out.
They couldn't just allow people to go stake a claim in the park. They had to be platted. A surveyor had to go out, create a map for them. And that took a while to happen because the Army was never given a budget, no allocation for doing things like hiring a surveyor.
So in 1884, the garrison changes. A detachment of the 23rd Infantry comes in, and one of the officers, Lieutenant Calvin Coles, apparently had something of a reputation as being a surveyor. And so when that new garrison arrives, people who had been advocating, who had been lobbying to lease those lots, basically wrote to the Secretary of War and said, there is no excuse anymore. There is someone here who can do it. And so the following year, he and another officer, Benjamin Morse, went out and surveyed those lots in the East and West Bluffs.
And then by 1885, the first lots were leased and the homes went up right away because there'd been this real demand. The idea of being able to live in the national park and have a cottage there was very attractive. And people wanted to build cottages on Mackinac Island. And so they scooped up the leases right away and construction began. Within the first year, 3 cottages were built, all on the East Bluff.
It was about $25 a year, which was not an insubstantial sum at that time. I think it was considered fair. It was raised to $50, I think, a few years after that.
They're still part leases. Most people don't understand that whole system. And that was, of course, that was the way the national park was helping fund itself, was to lease out some of these properties. And now that's continued with the state park, of course.
Most of the cottages you see on the East and the West Bluffs are within the park. And yeah, they're leasing that land. They own the building. They own the structure that's on it. And they pay taxes on that building. So they do pay personal property tax on the structure and then their annual lease fee on top of that.
It also gives the state park some control over what can be there and what can be taken down or changed about the properties, including what plants can be there as far as taking down trees and such like that. You have to go through the park still.
With the cottage leases bringing in some much-needed revenue, the fort could finally start to bring the park closer to Thomas Ferry's original vision and make it more accessible and enjoyable for the new tourism boom that the island's increased notoriety had caused.
With that money, finally, there were funds available to do things like create some additional roads and trails, some stairways down the bluffs, rebuild the lookout platform up at Fort Holmes, which had existed before, but under private hands, but now needed rebuilding.
Leslie Avenue out on the kind of northeast side of the island had been started several years earlier. They were able to finally complete it and make a very nice carriage drive out that way.
That is one of the contributions of the National Park period, is Leslie Avenue. I just rode it the other day on my bike and I thought, what a lovely winding trail through the middle of the island that now dates the late 1880s and is a real asset that came from the National Park period.
Mackinac had long been a famous island for a number of reasons, but now its national park status helped cement a new era for the island, where tourism was now the dominant industry. And, ironically, the effort to preserve and protect what made Mackinac special had also generated a spike in interest and attendance that resulted in a pressing need for additional development.
There weren't enough hotel rooms on the island, so new hotels were built, and ultimately that resulted in the construction of Grand Hotel in 1887. And once the Grand was built, that enhanced the reputation of Mackinac even more. It went from becoming a popular resort in the Upper Great Lakes to now the most fashionable resort in the Upper Great Lakes.
I believe it's Coles who even, in some of his letters, he talks about it being a desirable station. Those soldiers didn't see combat. It's entirely possible that they could come and serve their entire 5-year enlistment here, and the most dangerous thing they would encounter is a shovel or a paintbrush.
And while the garrison stationed on Mackinac Island had been the original rationale and means for protecting the island's natural resources and parkland, it turned out that it was ultimately the national park that would end up returning the favor by protecting the now crumbling fort at the top of the hill.
Pretty early on in the mid-1870s, Alfred Hoe, the commanding officer, wanted to tear down the North Blockhouse and reuse some of the stone in the foundation as part of the improvements that were going on inside the fort at that time.
The Secretary of War said no when that proposal crossed his desk, and he used the national park as the reason for denying that request. Even though the fort was not officially part of the park, he looked back at that legislation and said, preserving a building in the fort is very much in the spirit of why the park was created.
That's the earliest known preservation initiative on Mackinac Island, and that's why we have the North Blockhouse today, because otherwise those stones would be used somewhere else to build a wall. But fortunately, somebody in Washington said, no, that park is about preservation, and that building will be preserved.
And so amenities such as a bar room, a billiard parlor, a bathhouse, running water was available in the fort, so a whole running water system with and flush toilets were available to soldiers and officers alike.
While the increased interest in Mackinac as the perfect summer destination had brought an abundance of prosperity to the island, there were still grave concerns from some that the natural and historic character that Thomas Ferry and others had sought to preserve would be perpetually in danger. And as the national park neared the end of its second decade, a shocking announcement made those underlying fears much more realistic.
In 1894, the War Department said Fort Mackinac is not serving any military purpose whatsoever, and it's finally time to go.
The military significance of Fort Mackinac had faded many, many years before. The soldiers were here kind of taking care of the park and taking some target practice, and it just wasn't viable to keep Fort Mackinac as a military establishment any longer.
So that really is the reason why the national park, something had to be done with it. And there were proposals to simply just get rid of it, sell it off.
I would think that would have been a very nervous time. Not in some ways unlike where we are now, where we've got a lot of corporatization coming into the island. And I would think that would have been the same fear that we have right now, that things may change and we don't have much control over it. So I would think that would be very similar to what the folks, when they were saying, okay, now the soldiers are going away, we're not defending this Canadian border anymore, we don't need a fort here. You know, what's next?
Thankfully, for those who cared about the future of the island and the preservation of its past, an effort to lobby both politicians and the military was undertaken by residents to save the island as they knew it. And this time, with the help of another United States senator who had good reason to champion Mackinac and Michigan's interests.
It's interesting within just 20 years how public opinion apparently had changed. People on the island, people in the state were absolutely interested and intervened to make sure that none of those other options took place, that the island wasn't privatized, that it wasn't carved up.
Senator McMillan was just a powerful voice in Washington and a lover of park. So it was just very fortunate when this transfer was happening, this idea of transferring the national park to state control, that McMillan was in Washington in a very powerful position.
And he made it happen on the national end. Governor Rich in Michigan made it happen on the state end. And so combining the two forces made for the legislation that allowed for the transfer of the property from the national government to the state government, with a proviso that it always remain a public park for the people. And that's the way it still is today.
I think you can kind of imagine what would have happened here without the park.
There's all sorts of stuff. You know, after the Grand is built, there's a proposal, if it's by Plank, the initial manager, you know, what do we do with all the garbage? Let's basically create a giant pigsty and have hogs just running around to dispose of all the garbage. The commanding officer shot that one down.
There was a proposal that came through and the village council approved it, an electric railroad around the island. The War Department immediately rejected that idea, thinking that is not what the park was created for.
There's even proposals later on to build hotels at Fort Holmes, in Fort Mackinac itself, because those development pressures were there.
The island is not designed for that. The island is really designed to take a step back in time. Ride your bike, walk the trails, go in a horse and buggy ride a saddle horse. It's not designed for the hustle and bustles of the cities.
I think that the people on Mackinac Island truly understood that the national park was an important part of the success of the island as a tourism destination. And if it goes away, if this all becomes developed land, then all of a sudden you have really ruined the goose that lays the golden egg. And so there was great concern among businesses, among private individuals. You could read editorials in the newspaper saying, you know, this would not be a good thing for Mackinac to lose its park preservation status. And that's what helped put the pressure on the state of Michigan to take it over and make it a part of the state of Michigan, and in fact, Michigan's first state park.
When the state park is created, when it goes from a national park to a state park, it's the first one in Michigan. Michigan has no park service, no agency to care for parks, so it creates one, the Mackinac Island State Park Commission. Originally a 5-member body, today a 7-member body for taking care, overseeing the park. And one of the people appointed that first commission was, guess who? Thomas Ferry.
And so not only did he oversee the creation of the national park, he's in many ways responsible for it. He's also right there at the beginning when this becomes a state park and kind of sets the commission on the path that they're still on today.
Unfortunately, he didn't live too much longer, but he had that distinction of being our first chairman. And to this day, the commission still exists, a semi-autonomous state agency that directly operates this park and a few others at the Straits of Mackinac.
While the story of Mackinac National Park might not be one of the most well-known or often told tales in the rich history of this island, it is one of the most important chapters of the Mackinac story. A mere 20 years that would ultimately define the Mackinac Island experience a century and a half later, and provide a pride of purpose for those who still pledge to protect it today.
Having the fort, restoring it, the downtown historic buildings, as well as the natural landscape, that natural and cultural history and preservation intertwine is truly the story of Mackinac.
I have visitors that come and stay at my bed and breakfast who say, we come just to be because I feel better when I'm here. And they used to talk in the 19th century about the salubrious breezes of Mackinac, the healing breezes, the healing part of this island. And I think that's very true.
I don't think there's any question that for those who have lived here for a long time or worked here for a long time, there is a pride of purpose for the work that we do. It is that we realize that this is a really special place, unlike any other place, because we have these protected lands, these historic wonders, and we have this ban on automobiles where we have a pre-automotive environment. And so we understand that that's really special and important, and we take seriously our efforts to try and preserve that.
I think people today do realize that, and the Mackinac State Historic Park Commission and the City of Mackinac work well together. It's like two different governing bodies, but we have so many things in common that we have to work together to preserve the island and the history.
You go from about 50% of the island being protected as a national park, and that's what the state park started off as, and now it's over 80%, and it continues to grow, whether it's an easement or outright acquisitions. And so, yeah, now the State Park Commission is responsible for the majority of the island here, and that's preserved for visitors. And that purpose to protect it and preserve it and present it, which is kind of what I'm involved with, is still there. That's what we look to. That's our mission, to make this all accessible, interesting, and engaging for anybody who comes here.
If you come to Mackinac Island, you spend some time here, it seeps into your soul, and it really becomes a very meaningful place to many people. To local residents whose families may have lived here for 200 years, to cottagers whose family was from Chicago, who started coming here in the early 20th century, for example, or today, to visitors who come from around the world. They see this special place, they realize that the preservation of it is not for granted, and it's important to take care of it.
You can go up behind the Grand and get in the trails and see the wildflowers, go out to Arch Rock, go to Sugarloaf, go to Fort Holmes and look out over the Straits of Mackinac. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely, you're not going to find it anyplace else. And that's why we have to work hard to preserve it.
Funded in part by Mackinac Associates, friends preserving and sharing Mackinac's heritage in support of Mackinac State Historic Parks. Fort Mackinac is owned and operated by the Mackinac Island State Park Commission. Protecting, preserving, and presenting Mackinac's historic and natural resources since 1895.